If you can hear me, just shout. Alright, so this talk is going to be divided into 3 main parts. In the first part, I'm going to answer the question like what SSR even is. In the second part, I'm going to talk about when you should or you should not use it, and like why, what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks. And in the third and last part, I'm going to focus on the actual implementation and specifically on our migration from React application, which was bootstrapped with Create React App, to a server-side rendering solution, specifically Next.js. And quick information about me, just pretty boring stuff. I would say I'm a self-proclaimed full-stack developer, which pretty much means that I mostly focus on the front end, but I'm also sometimes forced to do some backend and database, and I'm not good at it. And I study computer science at Czech Technical University. I also have a Twitter account with like 30 followers or so, out of which like most of them are bots. But actually, when I was preparing for the talk, I thought like it would be cool to mention it. I published my first tweet yesterday, like first programming tip, and by like some sort of miracle, it got retweeted by Visual Studio Code and got like 200 likes. So maybe I'll do like another programming tip in a year or so.
Good job.
All right, so let's start the actual talk. What the heck is SSR? Like in this part, I'm going to address like what SSR is and how it compares to like regular web applications and single-page applications, so that we all are on the same page and even know what I'm talking about. So the way that traditional web applications work, so for example Wikipedia, I consider Wikipedia to be a traditional web application, is that we have a client, which is your browser, and when you go to, let's say, the page about Prague on Wikipedia, your browser sends a GET request to your server, and your server replies with the HTML, which is going to contain like all the information, all the content, all the buttons, divs, stuff like that. I can actually show you what I mean by that. If I search, for example, Prague Wikipedia, go there, there is all the content, and if I view the source code, and for example I search for this random part, it's definitely going to be there. So like all this HTML is sent from the server. Another important thing is when I want to click a link, let's say I want to know something about Brno. Oh, there's no link. Well, never mind. Let's read about Kings of Bohemia. You see that the whole page reloads, the browser sends a new GET request, and like all the information is again here. Alright, so, but like nowadays, what happened? Plug it out again, let's see if that works.
It's working.
Okay. Cool. So, then single-page applications. Like in my presentation, I call it casual single-page application, but like it's not any official naming. It's just how I wanted to call it. So the way they work is when you first go to the browser, or when you enter the address of that page in your browser, it's going to send a GET request again. But unlike as in the case with the regular apps, the browser is going to respond with HTML with like not much content. There's usually going to be just one div element and like maybe some sort of loader. But then when you get the request, the JavaScript kind of kicks in, and the framework of your choice, or you can do it like also in vanilla JavaScript if you want it, starts creating the elements using the browser API. So it's essentially going to call the document.create element and stuff like that until all the page is built up. But like if there is some content that you need to fetch, the content is not here because it didn't arrive from the server, only like one div arrived from the server. So you need to make an additional request to the server in order to fetch the data. Like why do we even do it this way, which like seems kind of complicated, and like I try to make the graph look complicated. It's because if we hit a link on the page, which is a single page application, the browser is not going to be refreshed because it's not going to fire another GET request to the server. It's only going to change the HTML or the DOM via JavaScript, so the page transitions are really smooth. I'll also show you a similar example as I did with Wikipedia. If I go to Netlify, which is a single page application, I log in and I view the source code. You see, like, there's not much here. There is just one div element in which the React is going to insert all the DOM nodes, and there is some sort of loader, I would say, and that's pretty much it. But like, the benefit is if I click a link, the page transition is really smooth. The browser doesn't refresh and it feels kind of natural. So like, that's the main benefit. Now, server-side rendering takes the best from the both approaches. So the benefit that you get with regular web applications is that when you first go to that page, let's say if you type in manually the URL into your browser, it's going to give you the content immediately. Whereas the benefit of single-page application is like the smoothness of page transitions. So we didn't want to give up on that. So with server-side rendered applications, we send a request to the server, then get all the HTML with all the content back, and then something called hydration happens. And hydration is basically attaching your JavaScript event listeners to the DOM elements that arrived from the server. So when you go to the page, enter the URL, you get the content, it behaves like regular web applications, but from then on, it behaves like a single page application. I can show you an example. So it's a website that I work on. It's a small Czech startup, it's an investment platform. So here it's unfortunately in Czech, so here is like a list of investment opportunities. And if I go here, you see that like all the content arrived on the server, but if I click link, the page transition is really smooth. There is no browser refresh. And I actually have a code example. It's in React. It uses no framework on purpose, so that you can you get the idea how it works. So I have two folders, server and SRC, which is for the front end. So what I do on server is I have a very simple Node.js application. Like when I hit the route, I call this method from React DOM API, which is going to take my application and render it to string. So it's going to spit out the HTML out of my application, and then I'm going to send the actual HTML response, and I'm going to insert the generated HTML here. If I go to the SRC folder, and actually this bundle corresponds to this. So when the JavaScript kicks in, it hydrates the application. So essentially what the hydration means, that it enables you to reuse the elements and attach the event listeners on here. If I didn't do the hydration here, if I would comment it out, the event listener wouldn't work. Alright, now that we have a basic understanding of what SSR is, let's move on to why you should use it or why you should not use it. So I think the main benefit is if you need the content of your application to be delivered really quickly. And by quickly, I mean, if you go back and see the difference between the casual or the traditional web applications, which are only like these two arrows. These single page applications have this like extra part. So this part causes that when you first enter the application, you are either going to get a blank screen or some loader. And this part causes like there is an extra round trip, so there is an extra request that has to be made to the server. So if your Wi-Fi is really slow, or if you are on a, let's say, 2G network, this is like an extra request that could be done on the server, which probably like isn't in, I don't know, located on a Czech railways train. Alright, so the main benefit is the quick content delivery, and like applications that can benefit from it are, I would say, e-commerce sites, because like in the e-commerce business, every couple of milliseconds matters. So basically, the sooner your customer gets all the content, the lower the probability that he leaves the site. And also like content-based sites can benefit from it. By content-based sites, I mean, for example, I would say like blogs or our application which have a lot of content that can be accessed from public. And just as a side note, like if you want to have a blog, maybe the server-side rendering itself isn't the best solution. You can do something like static export with Next.js or with Gatsby. Another benefit that is talked about a lot is SEO. Actually, why like this should even be the case? Why you should benefit like from SSR rendering if you are talking about SEO? Well, back in the days, Google crawler and all the other crawlers, it's a hard word to pronounce, crawler, didn't execute JavaScript. So if, for example, Netlify, and let's now imagine that like my Netlify account is publicly accessible. So if the Google crawler wanted to crawl this and didn't execute JavaScript, they would just see a blank page, or they would just see this loader. So like nothing really useful would get indexed. However, Google bot, I'm not going to say crawler again, Google bot executes JavaScript for like, I don't know, almost 5 years. So I think like this is no longer the case. Also, but if you read like articles about what are the benefits of SSR, why we should even use it, they often talk about it, but in my personal opinion, I think it's kind of overrated, because like if your only goal with SSR would be so that your web page is indexed on Google properly, you probably shouldn't do it. Like the problem might be that other crawlers might not execute JavaScript, like other not sophisticated ones, or maybe if you want to have like nice Facebook previews or nice Twitter previews of your web application, like if you share a link and you want to have the nice preview, you could also benefit from this. But like again, if this was your only concern, then like maybe SSR is an overkill for you. And like I haven't talked about the drawbacks yet, so like I'm just going to outline the drawbacks. Well, one of the drawbacks is that like extra server overhead, because you said you have to execute extra code on your server, and it can like cost you money or slow your servers down. And another drawback is, and we'll get to that in the last part of the presentation, is that like it's a little bit harder to code. Like even if with great solutions like Next.js, you still have to think about it, and you still have to like bear in mind that your code is going to be executed on client, on server, so that you don't have access to like DOM APIs on your server and vice versa. So like what's the verdict when you should know it or you should use it? Well, like to be honest, it's up to you. I'm not going to like say anything. I personally think it's not necessary with applications that like are mostly hidden behind an authentication, like Netlify that I already mentioned, or Slack, which I also checked they use React but they don't use SSR. I think it like doesn't make much sense. In other cases, it depends. Like if you have an e-commerce site, if you really want your page to load really fast, you should go for it. But like It's about the trade-offs. Alright, so now the actual case study. I'm going to briefly describe my or our migration. We migrated from a single-page application that didn't use SSR to Next.js, basically, which is a SSR solution for React. When we were actually preparing the migration, we were trying to find out some information about it, but we didn't find much information online. So this is one of the reasons also why I decided to give this talk. But we decided that we'll give it a few days and let's see if we move somewhere, and we moved, so it's good. And the benefit that we wanted to get from it is the improved page speed, because a lot of our application is publicly accessible and we wanted to benefit from it. And the two parts that I'm going to focus on are different routing. This is really Next.js specific, and then data fetching, because data fetching used to be and probably still is the, I would say, hardest thing about SSR. Routing. So as the previous speaker already mentioned, Next.js uses file-based routing. So basically, the path to your file matches the URL that you enter into your browser. And before Next.js, we were using React Router to do our routing. In theory, I looked up some articles that use React Router with Next.js, but we wanted to stick with the most canonical solutions because avoid potential problems with it. And I have a quick examples for those of you who don't know how the file-based routing works. So this 02 is the another example. So this is the home file and it's going to be available at /home. Then if we have a nested route, we put it into folder. So this file is, or this page is going to be available at /about/company. And the last important thing is when you have a dynamic route. So if you, for example, have a blog and you want to list all the blogs and use something like /blog/ID of the blog post, you would use this. So you would basically wrap the ID into brackets and then grab it from here and then fetch the appropriate post. So I think it's pretty straightforward. Regarding the migration, it's nothing really hard, nothing that you would have to think through deeply. But on the other hand, it's kind of a lot of manual work. It grows linearly with the amount of routes that you have. And the problem that I see with that is that if you are basically changing your whole application with that, because you have to migrate everything. So there is a possibility that you are going to make a typo or do a really stupid mistake. So I wouldn't recommend to do that unless you have your application covered with tests or have a good QA team. Now data fetching. So what are the challenges with data fetching? Basically, it's that your data fetches must be isomorphic. What does it mean? It means that the data fetching must be executed or must be able to execute both on your client, this means in your browser, and also on the server. Another tricky thing, or not so tricky maybe for some people, is request authorization, because you cannot depend on, for example, storing your tokens in local storage because you don't have the access to the local storage on your server. But originally I wanted to talk about authorization and authentication a lot, but then I decided that I'd rather avoid it, because if I say something stupid about data fetching, it's okay, but if I say something stupid about authentication and then somebody build something according to what I told you, I don't want to be responsible for that. And I'm not the expert, I'm a front-end developer mainly. So what you have to do if you fetch the data on the server, you cannot use like regular lifecycle methods or use effect hooks or whatever, because they are not executed on the server. So basically you have to fetch the data outside of the React execution context or any other like context. If you use Vue or Angular, I guess it's going to be similar. And I have a code example that actually shows you how it's done. This is done like in plain React and Node.js without any framework, so that you have the idea. So I have two pages. I have the docs page, which fetches docs and displays docs, and I have the users page, which fetches and displays users, and I have the server. So when I go to this route to /users, I first need to fetch the users here, because I cannot fetch them in the React execution context. I have to fetch them like directly in my controller, and then I'm going to pass the users here. The same thing is for the docs. Now, the problem is, if I first go to this page, to the users page, I get the users as props and I display them somewhere here. But then, if I click a link to the docs page, this is actually not going to be hit, because we are a single page application, so we use like client routing. So I also need to be able to fetch the docs on the client, and the way that I do it is that I use this component .mount. Now I think that you already like see the problem, I would say. So the problem is like that this code has to be at two places. If we don't use a more clever solution, it has to be both in the React component, for example in component.mount method, and also on the server. Like another problem is that we have to essentially hoist all the data fetches, because on the server we only have access to like the first component. If, for example, in the users page there was another component, like a child component called cats, and in the cats component we wanted to fetch some additional data in the component.mount method, we would like either have to also export this function and in the server pass it to the users page and then to the cats page, and like there is no workaround. So basically Oreo fetches that you want to do on the server must happen at very top level. Alright, fortunately Next.js has a very clever solution for that. It's a static lifecycle method, and like I'm putting it in quotes because like it's not really a like lifecycle method like most of the React applications are, because it's not executed in React context. This method is executed both on the server and also on the client. So before the application is actually rendered, Next.js is going to execute this method, and because it's static, it like doesn't depend on the components being initialized first, and then like on the client the execution is pretty much the same. And I'm going to show you how it looks like. So this is the last code example, and it's the very same docs page and users page as in the example number 3. It looks like this, and that's all. So you have this getInitialProps method, you fetch the docs, and you pass the docs as props to the docs page. So the benefits of this approach is that you don't have duplicate code, because this function is going to be executed both on server and also on the client. Like on the server is going to be executed before the application is rendered, using that render to string method, or you can use the render to static markup method, which is pretty much similar. And on the client, how it works, because like it's not a regular lifecycle method. So when you hit a link, when I would put a link here, let's say a link to the user's page, and I clicked that link, the getInitialProps method from the user's page would first get executed. I would grab the data, I would wait with the route transition until I have all the data, and when I have all the data, I would pass the data as props to this docs page. It's kind of clever solution. And yes, I know that like suspense is coming to React, so this all of like what I'm talking about might not be relevant in like few months, but like it's very early stage, and we'll essentially like see all the patterns that emerge with suspense, because some of the problems that I've described, like that you cannot use like lifecycle methods for the data fetching, might actually be solved, because with suspend you can essentially like defer rendering. You can pause the rendering, wait for the data to be fetched, and then continue rendering. Alright, so the last thing that I want to do is like describe the migration regarding data fetching, and it's similar to the migration in routing regarding that it's like a lot of manual work, but a lot of work, and you basically have to change everything. So what you have to do is to move the data fetching logic from the componented mount method or the use effect hooks or whatever you use for the data fetching, and move it to the getInitialProps method. It might get like tricky if you fetch the data in like child routes, which are, or child components, not child routes, which are nested deeply in the component tree, because you cannot, because the getInitialProps method must be at the top level. It must be at the page level. You cannot like put it arbitrarily throughout the code base. So like again, as with the routes migration, I would not recommend you to do that unless you either have your application covered with tests, which like we luckily were to some extent, or you have like a good QA team, because it's really likely that you are going to make a stupid mistake, because it's not like a hard job, but it's something that touches basically every part of your application. And yeah, that's all that I have, and now if there are any questions, I can try to answer them. Thank you.
Guys, do you have any questions to Tom? Okay, if not, Tom is gonna be around during the next break. We're gonna have like 10 minutes break, and then Steigerwald will continue with the TypeScript talk. Okay, thank you.